So next we have a grouping of three speakers who are going to present each for about 15 minutes individually, and then collectively after that we'll have some time for a panel discussion for each of them. The speakers in our next segment are John Gray, Dr. Danny Butt and Jenny Bopp, and they will be presenting on digital literacy. Where are Queenslanders now and where are we going? First off, John Gray will be delivering his speech to us. John's currently the Acting Executive Director of the Digital Economy and Policy Unit within the Queensland Government's Department of Science, IT and Innovation. That's a long title for a small business card. John's team is responsible for delivering the Queensland Government's digital economic strategy. This involves working on collaborative projects and events to encourage governments, businesses, researchers, community organisations and Queenslanders to adopt and use digital technologies and services to improve their business, work and lifestyles. Prior to his current role, John has held various policy positions within the Queensland Government since 2010, dealing with state infrastructure planning and charges, regional planning framework as well as innovation. John has also extensive experience working across the Australian Government, working for the Australian Government across national infrastructure investment and in transport security and counter-terrorism across maritime, offshore, oil and gas and aviation sectors. A long time ago, John's first full-time job was as Senior Transport and Road Safety Officer with RACQ. Please welcome to the stage, John Gray.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Dale. I'd just like to also thank Janet and her team for inviting me to be part of today's activities. So, being from the Queensland Government, I'll probably be more bureaucratic in my speech, but hopefully still interesting. Just to give a bit of personal insight, I've been in this role for probably 2 years now. It's probably been one of the most interesting, challenging and wonderful experiences of my working career. I've met people like Dale infinitum in terms of having wonderful ideas, being very passionate about what they do about improving lifestyles and people's lives, and particularly the community and the disadvantaged. Getting exposed to a diverse range of things, not just dealing with businesses and industry, but dealing with community organisations and the Indigenous and the disadvantaged. So, very passionate about talking about how we can actually get on board with digital literacy to improve the way we do things and make lives better. Tim was very good and gave, I think, everyone a very good description of what digital literacy is and what it can achieve. So I'll just probably quickly go through these slides in terms of probably demonstrating through pictures and a few other things about that we are actually in a generational change. We're facing rapid disruption to our lives that we probably have been unprecedented since the introduction of the automobile. So just to cover off a few things, digital literacy, as Tim touched on, while it encompasses the various types of literacy, is different from being literate. Reading and writing is separate from being digital literate. I've got a 3-year-old niece, and I think a lot of people with young babies and kids have similar examples of where you give them a tablet in front of them and straight away they know where to find stuff and do stuff on it, which leaves me for dead. But again, they can't read and write, but they know how to get themselves around a tablet and digital devices. So we've gone from essentially reading and writing and sending envelopes to each other to the phone came along, the laptop. The most important change probably in the last decade has been the introduction of mobile technology and devices, which has had a rapid transformational impact on how we do things and how we can talk and communicate with each other. Just a few interesting stats. I went to a presentation by Cisco in Sydney last year, and a few of these stats, and Tim touched on a few, just blow your mind in terms of, today's students are increasingly going to school, going to university, not knowing what jobs exist when they come out. The landscape's changing there. Again, 1,000 internet devices in 1984, 50 billion predicted by 2020. 2012, we created more information in that year than the past 5,000 years combined. And then from 2010 to 2020, what we know as the digital economy and the digital networks and infrastructures and what we do on them is predicted to grow 50-fold. Just a quick slide. This is showing essentially that Australians in particular are early adopters of technology. We're quick to buy, we have one of the highest per capita rates of smartphone ownership. We're quick to go online with our tablets and things like that. Again, to reiterate, that's different from being digital literate. Just because you own a device doesn't mean you actually know how to fully take use of it. Now to the interesting stuff, I suppose, with the Queensland Government, in terms of where digital literacy fits in with the new government's community objectives. So, the most key one for me is the building safe, caring and connected communities. There was a few questions before about infrastructure and what that enables. Again, the other thing it does enable is opportunities to deliver better services out to regional remote areas, but again, you need the infrastructure as well, so there's a fine balance there. It's good to see that the current government priorities do recognise that. Again, just to, I suppose we talk about digital economy without actually checking whether the audience necessarily knows what they may mean. So again, the simple definition, that's sort of getting there, but the probably simpler one is the marketplace on the internet. But it's a bit more than that, it's about what we do socially as well. Importance of digital literacy. I suppose more recently, particularly from a business jobs point of view, we've been asked to explain why should the government focus on digital literacy. To me, it's really simple, particularly to our young generations and the people trying to get a job these days. Unless you know how to access online and apply online and utilise the different networking social media functions like LinkedIn, Facebook and that, chances are you're disadvantaged when it comes to knowing about jobs and then applying for jobs. The other thing is, unless you have basic digital literacy skills, then maintaining a job becomes another issue. So, again, there's still opportunities for, I suppose, the labour-intensive jobs, but they're coming increasingly a need to at least know how to navigate yourself around basic digital technology, such as communication devices like smartphones. The other key areas are around, again, it means that you are better informed of information you wouldn't otherwise have access to, that you could either previously have to pay for or go to a library, or go to a business and pay for that as well. The other critical area is also, as we're seeing through recent natural disasters, it's a way of staying in connection or also sourcing some emergency equipment that if other traditional telecommunication means are down, or that the emergency services workers are inundated with helping people who are actually in dire need of assistance, that the community can step in through the various social networks to help each other out as well. And then probably the other part of digital literacy is also around the cyber safety and security. We hear all too often what's happening around cyberbullying and places like that, so it's also a need that while it opens up to a world of opportunity and wonder, we also need to be also cautious of how we utilise devices and how we protect our information as well. From the Queensland Government, my area's point of view, as Dale mentioned before, we last year released Go Digital Queensland, which is the Queensland Government's roadmap to using digital technologies, content, innovative services to connect communities, enable jobs growth and create a diverse economy. The action plan has over 50 sub-actions, so it's quite diverse. It covers everything from business, what we do as government, peoples and communities, and growing the digital industry sector. Probably the most important thing from my point of view is actually what we do in the people and communities area. Because again, everyone at the end of the day is a person. We're not just a worker, we're not just a government public servant. So from the point of view, what I'll touch on today is mainly around the actions that relate to digital literacy in the Go Digital Queensland strategy. So it's more about, I suppose, leveraging the various groups out there. So in terms of Telstra, the corporates, Info Exchange, who will be taking part in the workshop later on, also the various peak bodies, the university sectors, they're all doing stuff in this space. Everyone's got a lot of content, everyone's putting a lot of resources in it. What we're not doing too well at the moment is actually collaborating with each other and working out how we can actually have a strategic approach to making sure that we're getting the message out there, as well as delivering essential services to those who are really in need. The other critical part of this, and the other reason that's opened my eyes in the last couple of years, is the role that libraries play. I was a bit like Tim. It's been a while since I've been to a library. Again, I think the common misconception about a library is it's a place where you borrow things, as opposed to they offer so much more. And also, I think that's where I see a very low-hanging fruit in terms of us as government at all levels, as well as working with the business community and other bodies to really grasp what libraries are doing and actually utilise their services and support them. The other thing we've done when we released the strategy, we created an online hub, and this is really recognising the need to be more strategic and aware of what was happening across government and in communities, but also provide an opportunity for people to share their stories from a common site. So this is where hopefully over the next couple of years, people can go here as a business, as a community group, and see actually good case studies from the people's own mouths of what they're doing and the changes they're seeing and how they've affected other people's lives. Now, I've been provided some information by the State Library of Queensland of exactly what the libraries do. So I think the next few slides will actually, it was mind-blowing when I had to read them over the last couple of nights to actually see what reach the libraries have and the extent of digital literacy and programs that they actually deliver. So again, there's huge numbers in terms of in Queensland, you know, almost 22 million people visit public libraries, over 2 million members. There's not too many clubs who can say that we've got more than 2 million members. And again, the public Wi-Fi becomes a critical issue. It becomes a common thing I keep hearing all the time, that the only place you can really access free Wi-Fi that doesn't have really limits on it is going to be libraries, and you know, other businesses you normally have to pay to buy a coffee or something to access that similar thing. The other thing about libraries, which you know, we're starting to refer them as community digital hubs, is that they always had a role in terms of giving people access to technology when it was cost prohibitive. You know, as 3D printers, you can go to most libraries these days and print off something that you've designed or you've downloaded from the internet for relatively low cost or even free in some cases. You can't do that at businesses, or if you go to a photocopying centre, you have to pay an absolute large amount of money. Next couple of slides, just some interesting figures just show what's happened. So again, membership in libraries has remained pretty stable over the past 10 years or so, despite what's been happening in the digital realm. So the next slide shows that if we go the stereotypical view of what libraries are, is that they lend things. Well, that's decreasing over in terms of the physical items that they do. So for a library to remain sort of stable in terms of their membership must mean that they're offering some other value to the people visiting them. The bit that surprised me more than anything was the amount of public programs that public libraries actually offer. And as you'll see here, is that the attendees have increased rapidly over the last 4 years. You know, we're now up to 1 million people attending various public library programs. The other big difference has been in probably the last 3 years, we've seen a big increase in the amount of digital literacy programs being offered in public libraries. You know, there's amazing figures in terms of, you know, there's been a 33% rise in the number of people attending digital literacy events and the amount held in public libraries. So this figure that shows you the increase in 1 year. So in 2012-13, we went from 38,000 people attending to 57,000 people attending across Queensland. Went from 11,000 events to 20,000 events. Total number of hours of training delivered went from 9,000 to 38,000. You know, again, you think of those numbers and the fact that Tim mentioned earlier that Tech Savvy provides over 100,000 hours training. If you add those two numbers together, you start getting some huge amounts of training awareness out in the community. This map actually shows you, so it's not just located in central Queensland, so it's showing that the library network across the state is actually delivering these programs. Now, in terms of what we're doing as Queensland Government, again, the key thing we recognised in Queensland Government was the need not to duplicate what's already been delivered by other people. So through Department of Community, State Library and the other agencies responsible for Indigenous and disadvantaged and culturally diverse communities, we've established a Queensland Government Digital Literacy Steering Committee. That's an internal government body that's really there to see what we can do to leverage and collaborate with each other, and particularly some other corporate bodies as well as peak industry stakeholders, to make sure that we're not duplicating, that we're making the best use of resources, but also improving, I suppose, the outcomes of delivering these programs. Example, what's been happening at the national level. So one of the groups we've been in constant communication with has been Info Exchange, and to a lesser extent Australia Post. They launched earlier this year their Go Digi national program. That's a very innovative program. It's Creative Commons. They basically put information up on a website, the Go Digi website, which basically allows people to do what they want with the information. They don't have to ask permission. They can adapt it and use it however they feel. The other innovative approach about it, it's less structured from the traditional, I suppose, course of teaching you what it means, and then you do a structured course of how you utilise digital devices and your understanding of the environment. What it's based on is around activities. So if you like knitting, there's a module there saying how can you get the best out of knitting through digital devices. The example that was given to me by Brendan, who's sitting in the row there, was that if you're doing a yoga class, you do your yoga class, and at the end of the yoga class, the teacher says to you, okay, if you want to know more about what I do or make a booking, go online, and that's how you can do it. So it's teaching people how to do things through activities they enjoy. The other thing that Brendan's team are doing around Australia is through libraries, is rolling out some of the training modules, but also community events to actually understand what are the barriers facing community people, the challenges, and also getting feedback on what things that they can do to address it in the future. So it's actually a good forum to get feedback, but also then Brendan's team play an important role into feeding back into government and Telstra and other various organisations about what we can do together. Probably the critical bit facing Queensland, and it's good to hear someone from one of the regional areas answer that question about infrastructure, is let's not forget that we talk about digital literacy and expect everyone's got these devices, and you know, when you look at the whole population, yes, there's a very large percentage that use this, but again, when you talk about the small percentage that aren't connected or disadvantaged in using these devices, it's actually a large proportion of them live in the regional remote areas of Queensland. My boss keeps showing this photo as a way of saying, imagine if I'm going to give a training on awareness training on digital literacy, I go here and no one's really connected. I'm just wasting half of what I'm going to talk about because I say they either don't have a device to use or they don't have enough, I suppose, network speed or mobile coverage to actually understand what the benefits of it is. So that's a real challenge we need to face, is actually how can we get people access to the infrastructure. You know, it's interesting to say whether you put a kiosk in an area or, you know, Telstra putting out mobile Wi-Fi spots that are available to the community in general. So one of the things we've done as part of our Go Digital Queensland strategy is we've joined up with a few local governments to pilot a community online platform. It's a bit more than a community directory. There's lots of those about. There's a lot of passionate, dedicated individuals in these towns who set their own up and use it and, you know, don't charge anything just to get the community aware of what's happening in their township to make it more sustainable, but also more caring and social. So what our Town Plus More people have done is it's creating a site that actually creates a bit like the old, you know, the Spectator in the newspaper in these rural regional towns. It came almost like the community notice board, but also provide facilitated where people can have conversations with each other using the latest, you know, social technologies as well. So it's really about creating a regional sense of place as well. So it's aimed at, you know, the local councils. It's not about having a Queensland, our Town Plus site for the whole thing. It's about recognising that, you know, you need to build up the local community. So for Goondiwindi was one of the initial councils that we've worked with, as well as Charleville and Charters Towers. That's still being trialled as we speak. The good thing about it is a lot of those individuals who set up their own community directories have now been employed by the Our Town Plus More people. So providing them all the certainty and the stability of a supported platform. So that's what the site looks like for Goondiwindi. The other interesting thing about it's also trying to create economic viability for the regional towns as well, by making people aware of what they can buy locally before they go elsewhere. The other critical thing, and it was good to hear that Tim also touched on this about the Indigenous Champions. We've been working with a few external stakeholders as well as across government to develop a grassroots program that recognises people for their contribution that they're currently doing, but also trying to get, you know, community leaders involved in actually doing more for their for the disadvantaged and unconnected. There's already a lot of seniors groups, men's sheds, and through the tech savvy programs in other states doing a lot of this awareness training. Some of the feedback I've got in some of my talks with some of these groups has been that a lot of them aren't doing it for money, they're doing it because they really want to help the community. What some of them are finding is that they don't have any formal recognition to get their foot into the door to those who actually need the training. So to me it was a simple no-brainer in terms of saying, well, we can help them out there. So what we're looking at putting together is not an awards program, it's actually recognising those who actually personally help those who are in need. So hopefully there'll be an announcement coming soon from the Queensland Government about what we're doing with that. Again, we're working in with Info Exchange and a few other groups to make this part of a national initiative. And then also it's looking at how can we also recognise and put something back into these people who do a lot for their communities. So the other thing we're going to do is try and look at getting these people together to share their lessons, but also give them access to some of the more important decision makers, and we can see an expanded rollout of digital literacy awareness training. So, you know, these numbers themselves tell you that digital technologies aren't going away. We are going to be impacted heavily over the coming future. We're already seeing companies like Airbnb change the face of how we book rooms and how hotel chains operate. We're seeing, Uber change the face of how we book taxis. We're seeing rapid changes all over the place that happen overnight almost in terms of an industry's perspective. So, we need to be aware of what the changes are, how they're affecting us, but also how we can take advantage of them and embrace them. There was a few videos on, if you look on the internet for Internet of Things, or you look at even TV ads coming out today, they're showing you increasingly, some bright ideas on how technology is going to change our lives. The next big thing is probably going to be wearable technologies, communicating with your devices at home, or it comes autonomous. You just wake up and it's like a Wallace and Gromit cartoon in terms of, it dresses you, makes you coffee. All you do is just wander around in a daze and everything happens around you. It happens to me sometimes already. So, look, the big thing I would just like to leave on, though, is probably the biggest thing that I've become aware of probably in the year or so that I've been delivering the strategy with my team is the important role that libraries play. Particularly the State Library. One of the things that has come across to me recently is the magnitude of funding that they deliver out to the communities through the public libraries. Where I see there's actually a great role for us to play in both government and the peak bodies and the corporates is actually saying how can we leverage what the state libraries do, particularly at the local government and state government levels in terms of working together to maximise what the individual librarians do. Like there was a grants program I was recently had the privilege of looking at, and basically all the proposals that were put forward by the librarians were done purely from within the library and without any sort of communication with their local council or other groups. But all the ideas affected businesses and community groups. You know, it's about getting 3D printers into libraries or running workshops or business weeks. And from my perspective, who's used to coordinating stuff across government, it was saying we could do so much a better job if we got more people involved. Because all I saw was all these passionate individuals spending a lot of their own time doing stuff that could have been done better, but expanded delivery if more people involved, or the other thing we're doing with the programs that have been delivered at the national level, as well as talking to Tim on a few other things, is saying, okay, there's already a good program out there. These people are already delivering their own training on this stuff. How about we connect the dots and get the people who like delivering this stuff to their community, but giving them the formal structure and support behind it. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you, John. All right, we're going to keep moving through our grouping of speakers now. Dr. Danny Butt is a writer and a researcher and a critic and a research fellow in participatory public space at the Research Unit in Public Cultures at the University of Melbourne. Beginning his career as a musician, go rocker, designer and curator and organiser, he has written, lectured and consulted widely on new media and cultural politics, including work for intergovernmental agencies such as Orbicom UNESCO, UNDP and ASEAN. Danny's also the editor of books Place, Local Knowledge and New Media Practice and Internet Governance, Asia Pacific Perspectives. Please welcome Dr. Danny Butt.
Thanks. I'd also just like to begin by acknowledging Songwelman Maruchu Barambo for the wonderful welcome. And to the Turrbal peoples, broader Aboriginal nations who've maintained the land that this wonderful library is built on. Growing up on the Gold Coast in the 1980s, I knew that communities were working to protect their knowledge along this bank of the river, but I was not yet culturally literate enough to appreciate the importance of those efforts that they undertook against oppressive circumstances. We've got a lot to thank them for. Thanks also, Jenny, Colin, for the invitation. Great event. Being an academic, I'll take the opportunity to make more kind of conceptual and speculative remarks, maybe. And even though I now live in Melbourne, hopefully some of it relates to you, even though I'm not sure I can address where Queensland's at and where it's going. My first memory of digital literacy was basically pointless. At 12 years of age, I learned how to use the basic programming language on my Commodore 64 to make pixels appear on the TV. I decided to extend this newfound skill by creating a visual epic. I glued sheets of graph paper into a large sheet, traced my subject matter onto it, and translated each of those pixels into a poke command that I could use to, that I'd type into the computer and then save to cassette tape. And then after a couple of weeks of this, my realistic portrait of Garfield came to life. What was I learning? A kind of craft, one that felt contemporary. As a viewer who consumed images on screen day and night, the process of making something appear on a TV that was mine and no one else's, my views on intellectual property were a little more conservative back then, fulfilled me in a way that more rote learning at the school encouraged did not. I read a lot, as my good parents encouraged me to, but I had little sort of focus or objective other than the satisfaction of completing the book. And it wasn't until I was about 14 or so that my uncle in Sydney introduced me to science fiction, and then, then I discovered that the world of a book could actually be a world I could enter as sort of my own, as a way, in a way. But this space of programming felt like mine from the beginning. I was making my own world, even if a kind of just particularly flat one. Luckily, the Commodore 64 was cheap enough for my parents to afford it, as our library could not. If it was today, of course, the construction would probably be on Minecraft with its billions of square kilometres of social pixelation, and I'd probably be like my friend's nephew making YouTube how-to videos on, advanced Minecraft techniques. No doubt my childhood videos would have that smug air that comes from the future teacher. And perhaps I'd be, working in this social form of production, joining an actual community of people making things, instead of what I grew up with was a sort of an idealized community of people making cool things that I, came to through Computer and Video Games magazine when I'd go to the newsagent after school and get that magazine and think, great. I'm really going to be kind of working this poke command better, having read this. But it was also a training of the imagination to be able to sense a community that was not directly in front of me. And having spent the many hours learning those skills in an autodidactic way didn't really become to mean something directly productive in the economic sense that we understand it today, until the World Wide Web came along in the early 1990s, and I was just starting to get paid as a writer and designer in the music sector. And what I realized was that I wasn't really intimidated by the coding of hypertext markup language or indeed of JavaScript, even though, I haven't had any technical or mathematical training. I'd spent all those years kind of hammering out pixels on the on the keyboard of the C64. I just knew that if you wanted to get what you wanted to happen, you just have to make your demands flexible to the capability of the machine, and then you sort of just puzzle it out. And this turned out to be much more enjoyable than trying to reverse engineer, a human boss or your parents or, those kinds of things. It's an experience of autonomy and a certain kind of freedom. My university colleague, the Gondomara artist, Professor Richard Franklin, notes that when you've got art, you've got a voice. When you've got a voice, you've got freedom. When you've got freedom, you've got responsibility. And I think that sort of sequence of events is kind of quite important for our thinking about the relationship between literacy and citizenship. So nothing in my story would be news to any of you who are educators. You know that coercion is the opposite of learning. And this is why, the architect of the modern university, Wilhelm von Humboldt, advocated the principles of freedom to teach and freedom to learn, right? These two things are kind of have to be bound up together. Yet the focus on literacy as an object of policy is sometimes accompanied by ever more authoritarian assessment regimes to ensure that the knowledge has been learned in the right way and to discipline those who do not. University of California scholars Glenda Hull and Gregorio Hernandez note that the definitions of literacy continue to be debated. Pendulum swings in public policy have shifted the attention of schools and teachers to what some consider increasingly narrow understandings of literacy. And this narrowing has occurred even as a great deal of research has simultaneously documented the considerable intellectual accomplishments of children, youth, and adults in out-of-school settings, accomplishments that often contrast their poor school-based performance and suggest a different view of their potential as capable learners and doers in the world. And here, I think, is sort of where the spaces created by public libraries become extremely, extremely important. And I think, as the earlier sort of speakers have noted, that I too had not been a big user of public libraries for quite a long time until my current partner, who is a mad library user, go along with her and just actually being incredibly surprised and moved by the way that these kinds of spaces brought communities together, and in particular members of the community who may not have the financial resources to participate in the other areas of social life, which increasingly require a lot of money. When we were doing interviews with a whole lot of people who are sort of library managers and users, they talked about one of the most important pieces of feedback they got was that it was one of the few places you could go where someone's not after your wallet, as the major, as the major force. So, coming back to this question of kind of literacy, in a different paper working with Elizabeth Mohe, Glenda Hull asked the question, what is the development of literacy the development of? And their summary of the research on new literacies over the last kind of 30 years or so is quite useful. Firstly, they say that literacy learning is situated in and mediated by social and cultural interactions and tools. It occurs via a range and blend of explicit and implicit teaching, usually guided by interaction with a more knowledgeable other over time. Across the age range and from all social cultural groups, people learn and practice literacy outside of school, often with high degrees of proficiency. And to learn literacy well, students need meaningful purposes for engaging in literate practice and opportunities to use literacy for a broad range of life activities related to goals and desires beyond the moment of instruction. Finally, learners require, and literate ability now consists of, facility with composing, interpreting, and transforming information and knowledge across various forms of representation, not only text. And, again, this is, I think, for any of you who work in sort of the literacy area or education, these are sort of fairly kind of common sense sort of things from the academic literature, but I think kind of condensing it into those 5 points is kind of quite useful because we can think about the sort of literacy in a broader sense and maybe decouple it a little bit from the kind of reading, writing, arithmetic kind of models. In particular, that one for number 4 is I guess what I'm proposing is this idea to think about, goals and desires beyond the moment of instruction. What are they? I think, for me as a teacher, that's a really important part of teaching, is to try and sort of activate those in some way, or not so much activate them, but provide a space where they can be activated. So what does, my contention is that rather than thinking about literacy, maybe the best way to think about literacy is to pay some attention to the literary. And what would it mean to think about the literary in this kind of new ICT networked context? Was my experience of copying Garfield into the computer an experience of the literary? Well, of course, a cultural traditionalist would say absolutely not. But I argue that it was, and that today we have to include gaming and also social media that have generated more archival material than all the world's physical libraries put together, as we heard earlier on. So to consider these forms as having the potential of literary is to ask what it would mean to become a writer rather than what it would mean to become someone who can simply functionally write. I usually teach in art schools, and it's a commonplace there that you can't teach someone to want to be an artist, but you can easily teach them to not want to be an artist usually by sort of inattention and by various kinds of bureaucratic kind of suppression, which happens without us thinking about it, and so we try and avoid that at all costs. So to just kind of think about this kind of a term which can hold these in the discussions of literature. Two of the most potent theorists of writing are the philosopher Jacques Derrida and literary critic Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who've used the term teleopoiesis in describing this kind of literariness. And so coming from these kind of two different Greek roots, we know the kind of term tele, which is about this kind of linking of one thing to another. Spivak says that all communication is a form of telecommunication. It goes to another space. It connects. And then poiesis, which is a sort of a making or transforming or continuing. It's where we get the term poetry from, but it's also a kind of, a sort of fashioning of something. So if we think about those two terms, Spivak pulls them together and says that it describes as kind of an imaginative making that reaches toward a distant other. Yeah, this is sort of the definition of illiteracy. We're creating something for someone who is yet to come. We don't know who they are or what they will think of it when they get there, but we fashion it, and in that space we're reaching out to someone at a distance. And it's where we sort of start to realize that as humans we're born to be connected to others, yeah, and that we're not actually the entrepreneurs of ourself, which the more kind of economic rationalist kind of viewpoints would kind of like to think of us as. We create a language, and that becomes a hospitable space where others can come to rest. So Derrida and Spivak emphasise that reading is a creative act, which is something that is too often lost in our discussions of literacy, I think. The act of crafting language, if you talk to people who are writers, they will tell you that it's often not particularly creative. It's extremely hard work, and it's just, it's pulling all of these things together to kind of achieve a certain outcome. It's satisfying, but the creativity comes from our experience of our world being touched by the world of the text we read, even when that other world is a world that we first wrote ourselves. So for anyone who writes, you're always your own first reader. It's a kind of paradox, and you can feel that external world that you've created kind of, coming into contact with you. I think in this idea of a world which is created within a literary work, we start to kind of sense the power of libraries, because they've held this kind of, amazing kind of universe of worlds within each library. Yeah, and so when I think I learnt to read, you discover that a library is a very open space. There are all kinds of worlds that you can enter and take up, and that's extremely, extremely powerful. Derrida and Spivak are both keen to point out that this, in their different ways, that this is not limited to the alphabetic kind of language. So image, sound, spoken word share this same generic structure. We leave a trace or a mark, and then sometime after the fact, it's kind of taken up by the creative reader who finds themselves in it and gets to change themselves with it. YouTube didn't think about themselves as becoming, setting out to become a library, but that is clearly the kind of, the role which they take on at a scale that dwarfs almost any library. And as any of you will know who have kind of, people in your family who are younger, it's the first place you would go to find out how to do something, rather than going to a book. So what happens when the archive of worlds once held by the library is now dwarfed by the universe of universes that is the internet, where the walls of the library, which have been built strong to protect and preserve knowledge, have become permeable and become a kind of place where information is kind of, from which we can access this information which is beyond its walls. And I think that's somewhere that, State Library of Queensland with the Edge has sort of been inspirational and internationally in sort of, seeing how to respond to this conundrum. I was going to finish with some discussion of libraries as community hubs, but I think that's all very well kind of established by most of the people here. So I'd like to, and then I was going to talk about the Indian librarian Ranganathan's 5 Laws of Library Science, which we could update for the internet age. But rather than kind of doing that, I'll just kind of finish on another example from the scholarly archive that might give us something to think about. We've already had some discussion about the platform, and in our research we've discovered that some of the best early thinking on platforms comes from the Italian organisational theorist Claudio Claudio Ciborra, who started using the term the platform organisation in the early 1990s. He was doing field work on the company Olivetti in 89 and 1990, and he comes up with this idea of the platform organisation, which he describes it as different from the network organisation. The platform's a system of schemes, arrangements, and resources, whereas the network is a flexible cluster of specialised units coordinated by market mechanisms instead of a vertical chain of command. So the network has, this kind of root transactions kind of flowing around in this sort of horizontal way, but the platform has this kind of higher level where it's able to recombine all of these things together. He says this decoupling of process know-how from the more generation of product innovations leads to a dualistic system where strategic management of the platform mainly consists in placing bets about what will be its next primary task. All other choices, such as alliances, vertical integration, and so on, follow the provisional outcome of such bets. So for examples of this, we can think about Apple kind of going into mobile telephony and then into, say, health, right, that we have now, Samsung moving into pharmaceuticals and biosimilars. We can think about Google and kind of mapping. These are firms which are able to use their kind of market position to move into this new space and then integrate it with things that they already do to create a platform where everything starts to become integrated. So this is, I think, quite important for us to think about with digital literacy. The internet is now less a network of computers, as 30 companies now account for more than half of internet traffic. So this idea we have of the internet as being just this, there are millions of people out there all connected by this network, it's not really like that. There's this kind of consolidation of kind of private networks which are hooked into, for example, mutually incompatible interfaces or kind of, or devices. So the way I describe it is we're becoming less of citizens belonging to a nation state and more like, users, instead of being governed by those laws, we're more like consumers belonging to platforms governed by end-user license agreements. Like the number of agreements that you'd be subject to every time you clicked agree would give a lot, you wouldn't want to have to employ a lawyer to go through all of those. So as the globalisation and privatisation of infrastructure proceeds apace, the operations of a platform like Facebook are only marginally affected by your literacy and being able to read its kind of, its interface itself, but also even being able to read its business model or its algorithms doesn't always necessarily help you that much in terms of it affecting the way that it goes about doing things, right? There's a sense in all of the kind of public sector research we've done where there's so much of this new infrastructure, whether it's Uber, as was mentioned, just basically displaces what were kind of more publicly accountable forms of infrastructure. Sometimes, whether it's better or worse is not really that important, it's just that it has a different kind of set of relationship to the nation state. So in the end, the power of Google or a Facebook is not simply the possession of proprietary algorithms or data, but it depends on this combination of both of them and how it can weave them together. Access to, data without the capacity to utilise it is kind of insufficient. And few competitor institutions, including government agencies and universities, possess the required scale of analytic capability that are generated by these kinds of new platforms. So user power, what can users do in these arrangements? I suggest that it's not about their relationship in literacy as we might kind of see it in being able to kind of technically click this or that, although of course that is important, but perhaps in an adoption of effective movement around and between platforms, to be able to kind of sense the kind of constraints of certain platforms and to kind of move between them with some fluidity. And I think that's something that maybe relates to a skill in reading of some kind. I think if you sort of listen to young people talk about why they do or don't use certain social media platforms, what they're doing is a kind of reading of that world that's created and whether, Facebook's too creepy or it's full of old people or, the various sort of things that sort of, are affronting to them about it. And there they can kind of interpret, from that reading they interpret, openings and exits in which to move. So I'll just finishing there. I think that's that's just a set of questions perhaps that our research is kind of grappling with at the moment. I hope some of those are kind of useful to you, and yeah, thanks again for a great day.
Great, thank you, Danny. Our final presenter in this segment is Jenny Bopp. Jenny is the Principal Statistician and Team Leader in the Queensland Government Statistician's Office in Queensland Treasury. The office is the primary source of statistical and demographic research services within the Queensland Government, providing public good and additional services, primarily statistics and other information for Queensland communities. Jenny's team coordinates statistical networks across Queensland and provides information and advice to assist people in using statistical information, products and systems. Please welcome to the stage, Jenny Bopp.
Good morning, everyone. It's been an interesting start so far. I've been fascinated with all the speakers. It's a pity Marucci's left because I was going to say that was one of the most beautiful welcome to countries I've ever seen. I did meet Jeanette before she just had to leave, unfortunately, but it was lovely to meet her this morning, and also to hear from Tim OLeary. Tim did use some statistics in his presentation, and I was listening to see if he was going to say anything that I was planning to say, but luckily I hope there's no duplication there. John, thanks for your presentation, that was interesting, and Danny, I found that fascinating too. So, yeah, it's lovely to be here today. In preparing for today, I was just reflecting on a couple of things. I guess, firstly, a little bit about myself. My qualifications are in social work, psychology and anthropology. I've always had a strong interest in people and how we are. But I guess I have a working career of over 30 years in the Queensland Public Service in a range of roles. And I guess I started off in human services but gravitated to computerisation projects in the late 80s. And I kind of loved the whole information industry from then and have been working in that area ever since in different roles, from information policy, statistics, communication, even marketing. So for the last 12 years I have been in the Queensland Government Statistician's Office, very happily working there. One of the projects we did work on a few years ago was the whole information licensing framework, which established Creative Commons as a way of licensing content on the internet. So our office has always been interested in things like that. I guess the other reflection I had in preparing for today was just thinking about the way that public libraries have been such an important part of my own growing up, my family life, from growing up in the 1960s at the Gap, and our family always had a weekly drive up to the Ashgrove Library where my dad would race off to all the boating books. My mother would go and snatch the latest magazines on fashion and cooking, and myself and my two sisters would just grab whatever the latest kids' books were at the time, and then we'd all stack them up in the back of the station wagon and drive on home. More recently, my son, we didn't actually have a computer at home initially, so we had to go down to the Grange Library to access the internet. And then a few years ago, my dad, who had retired, thought that he should learn how to use a computer, so off he went to the Caboolture Library and was taking some lessons there. And it's lovely now to see my niece and my great-niece, who's one, going off to the Grange Library for the Mums and Bubs program. So it's just been a lovely relationship our family's had with public libraries. But anyway, on to my presentation. I am aware that I'm the last speaker of the morning, so please bear with me. I am talking about statistics, but I'm hoping it will tell you a story that you're interested in. So yes, as mentioned, our prompt is where are Queenslanders now and where are we going? And of course I'll be using some statistics in my presentation. So I know a lot of you would probably know our office, but for some of you who don't, I'll quickly talk about who we are and what we do. I am going to touch on definitions of digital inclusion and literacy and provide you with some measures of those for Queensland. I want to share with you some of the challenges that our statistical users have in accessing and using statistical data, just to throw that in there. And then I want to finish on the note of our responsibility as generators or providers of digital content and the onus on us to provide user-friendly content. So this is our office. Is anyone aware of our office or had contact with us? No, not many people. Okay, so we're basically the Queensland Government Statistician's Office. We call ourselves QGSO for short. We used to be OESR, for those of you who may have known that acronym. We are the primary source of statistical and demographic research services and advice across government, providing a range of free services. There's a stack of reports, raw data and maps on a huge range of topics available on our website. If you're familiar with our website, you may not be familiar with some of the additional services we do provide though. So we do maintain an integrated service across governments. We work very closely with the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We actually report up to, our senior person is the Queensland Government Statistician, Mr. Anthony Skinner. And he has a very close working relationship with the ABS. We also provide a lot of advice on data gathering and reporting. We produce the Queensland population projections with the next set due out before Christmas, I understand. We also conduct official surveys for Queensland Government departments. So we do have a wonderful little piece of legislation, the Statistical Returns Act, which is probably one of the oldest and briefest pieces of legislation in the government. We're very fond of it. It enables us to do our work. And we also provide advice and guidance to agencies. So our vision is really to support better decision making to advance Queensland using data and information. So digital inclusion, I'm using Info Exchange's definition here, a definition I really liked. So I think it's been quoted before, ensuring everyone, regardless of income, age, gender, ethnicity, employment or ability, has equal and affordable access to technology and the digital literacy skills that support full participation in modern society. So how do we measure this? So I just wanted to give you these two measures, and I'm focusing on Queensland here. So really, and I should acknowledge Lise Noon, who's here from my team. Hi, Lise. Lise is our statistical coordinator and maintains the relationship with the ABS and Queensland Government departments, and Lise has helped to pull this information together today. But there's two main sources, the census, which is held every 5 years, and I should say we're very happy to hear that there's going to be one next year as well, because we love our census data. It's like Christmas time for statisticians, so we're very relieved to hear the ABS is going ahead with that one. So I just wanted to share with you that the census started asking questions about internet and computer use in 2001, and they were very much about use by individuals. So this question actually changed in 2006 and 11 to a question focused on dwelling internet connection, so that's connection at the home. A more recent source of state-level data for Queensland is the household use of information technology. And our office has actually produced a Queensland bulletin based on this release. So you probably heard Tim mention that 84% of Queensland householders do have internet connection, and that's roughly on a par with Australia, which is at 83% and growing. So over time, you can see from this graph that 2005 it was just a little bit above 60%. It has grown about 6.1% per year. This stops at 2012-13, so it would be interesting to think about where things are at now. Compared to other states, Queensland's about on average, so we're always behind the ACT on anything to do with ICT. They streak ahead, but yeah, we're on about average with the other states. They're a bit ahead of Tassie. We do know Queensland is a huge state, and while that figure I was talking about is an average for the whole state, of course there's huge variation once you get out of southeast Queensland. So this is a thematic map based on the Statistical Area 3 geography, and it shows that really internet connection is highest in the southeast corner, closest to the metropolitan centre of Brisbane. It's high in some regional centres and in some resource areas or the mining areas around the state. But once you go further west, of course, it's much lower. So digital inclusion, what can we say from this? Well, I guess we can say, and we've heard the message already this morning, is access is evolving. So really, how do people access the internet now compared with when we have those formal statistics from 2011 or 2012-13? Is it from home at the household, mobile devices, smartphone? I know most of us carry these. Mine actually doubles up as a yellow card when I'm trying to get my son to stop doing something. Stop, that's enough. What I did want to share with you is that a little bit of our business information at work. We do run household surveys, as I mentioned, and we do know that about 25% of Queensland households now only use a mobile phone. They don't have a landline. That figure changes depending on where you are, so it's up to about 37% in some areas in the southeast corner. We don't really know what proportion of these are smartphones, although we did get some stats on that before. Okay, so moving on to literacy, and I think we've seen some of these definitions already. I just wanted to emphasise the second one, I suppose, because it talks about why it's important, and I think we've heard from other speakers today, so I won't spend too much time on that. But just to look at a measure, and Lise actually found this piece of information for us, which is, it comes from the ABS program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and these basically measure 3 critical information processing skills: literacy, numeracy and problem solving in technology-rich environments. So you can see that we're pretty much on the Australian average. The ACT is streaking ahead as usual. And this is for adults, like people 15 to 74. So Queensland is on a par with the rest of Australia generally there. But what about the future? How are our kids doing? So I guess the best measure of this is from the report on government services. This is actually the 2015 report. We've got 2011 there because it's the latest data available in this chart. But you can see, oh, and I should add that PrEP was introduced into Queensland schools, I think around 2008. So this data actually predates the PrEP students. So this shows that Queensland students in 2005 were only slightly ahead of Northern Territory students and lower than all other states in achieving at or above the proficient standard in IT performance. So in 2008, Queensland Year 6 students had improved, however, our relative position was the same. And in 2011, Queensland had further improved and were ahead of Tassie and Northern Territory. So there's some improvements happening there at the Year 6 level. Let's have a look at Year 10. So Year 10 seems to catch up a bit. There's not such a marked difference. In 2005, the Year 10 students were ahead of WA, Tassie and the Northern Territory. 2008, it improved again slightly. In 2011, there was another slight improvement, and and Queensland was the only state apart from the Northern Territory to register an increased proportion for that year. Other states and territories actually fell back. So we could probably say that for students of Queensland, digital literacy is improving over time. I think we've heard today about the groups that are most affected by low digital literacy, and these are up here now. Oops, that was a little cartoon about, is this being digitally literate? But I guess there's a concern also, not just in the traditionally socio-economically disadvantaged groups, but other Australians who feel that they may be being left behind or have concerns about keeping up. The Australian Institute of Family Studies published their study earlier this year, and you might be interested to go and read a little bit more about that. For our own office, we know that, and I mentioned before, we have networks of over 900 people around Queensland, and we do ask them what their challenges are in dealing with our data. And we know that generally there are some concerns, because we know these people are busy people. They're working in the Queensland government or local government or Commonwealth or the non-profit sector. So they do find it difficult to know what data is available out there, to navigate the huge volume of information, to work their way around the various websites, and also they may have limited statistical skills. So we know that in our office there can be not only a digital divide but a statistical divide as well. So I guess the way we've responded to that is by making our products a lot more user-friendly. And I just wanted to end the little presentation here on to focus on one of our tools, which is a fabulous little tool which we'd love everybody to know about, the Queensland Regional Profiles. We've done an example here for the Fraser Coast Regional Council local government area. Within these profiles there's different types. There's resident, time series, workforce, Indigenous, snapshot and comparison regions. So just as an example, the resident profiles are handy little tools. You can produce these profiles in under 30 seconds. They're amazing little things. And they're very useful for identifying if low digital literacy is likely to be an issue for your area. So if you're trying to get some data together, these profiles contain just about everything you'll need to provide some measures for your area. This is just an example of what the pages look like. So you can see here for the Fraser Coast, just having a quick look at that age-sex pyramid, that you're looking at a much older community with the bulge out there in the older age groups. These pages just contain information on the Indigenous and population and internet connection for that area, education, disability, and also the index of relative socio-economic disadvantage. Our offices also work with the Brisbane City Council and also the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships to help them develop profiles for their organisations as well. The Know Your Community one is a beautiful little profile focused on data for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Queensland. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that if you're interested. That's about it for me. If you need more information, there's some contact details. If you'd like to be part of our network, we would love you to join. You can see me after the break if you'd like. We also run information sessions, and we can do this via teleconference to your organisation if you're located remotely. We had our first one to Mount Isa on Friday afternoon, and it was very well received. So, yeah, if you're interested in any help with stats, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I'll just ask our last three speakers just to quickly join us on the stage here. and we'll have a quick time for some questions, and then we'll have a break. I'm sure people are getting some coffee at this stage of the morning. I think we have some roving microphones as well. Okay, are there any questions that we have for our speakers? Yep.
I'm just wondering, with the access to information so freely available, if I guess the elephant in the room with regard to digital literacy isn't how accurate that information that is obtainable is.
Are you talking about statistical information?
Well, statistical information, one coming from a reliable government resource, you would think it would be accurate, but it's that availability to other sources of information that may not have that that rigour. Thank you. That rigour with regard to the reliability of information.
Yeah. Well, certainly from the statistical side, say for example those regional profiles, we wouldn't put data in there if we weren't confident that it was of a suitable quality to put in. We do have a look at all the sources of information. With the regional profiles, we have to make sure that it's of a good quality, because we publish information at small areas of geography. So it's the best data that is available. Yeah.
Question over the other side.
From the sounds of what you're saying, I mean, there is a lot of help coming from the libraries to consume a lot of this digital information. How do you think libraries should be responding in actually the production, so to participate in the production of this environment?
Probably would have been a good question for someone from the state library to answer, but from my perspective, you know, I suppose at the end of the day, the libraries are more a conduit for the information. They also tend to be the front line in terms of the users of the library requesting what information, so they have a better idea of what's been asked for, as opposed to us in government, and necessarily the other organisations aren't necessarily fully aware of what the actual requests have been asked for. So we need to tap into the library resources and then support them from our end of those who actually produce the content, of using them more as a conduit into the local communities. Similar case with our Department of Communities colleagues is understanding how they operate in terms of they use organisations like QCOS, who have the relationships with their client groups as opposed to the government. So it's actually improving our communication channels. Just touching on the previous question as well, in terms of one way we can do that is get a better insight into the information and data being collected. With the digitisation of data and, you know, more powerful computers coming along, we can analyse the data quicker, faster. We've got the new jobs being created, which is their jobs to offer insights into that, which then give better informed decision making, rather than, you know, surveying people to death, which is what's happened previously with a lot of industry people. And it's really just a representation of that statistical group, as opposed to more accurate, is what people's either... You look at things like TripAdvisor, it's giving direct feedback from the user perspective, which is available to the public. One of our things we want to do with the Go Digital Queensland Hub was provide, you know, along that lines where people can share their direct views on where their issues are, and case studies of where they're seeing improving, where they see gaps, without necessarily being blinkered by or filtered by a government reinterpretation of their stuff. So through our Go Digital Hub, it's an example where we say people can upload their stories. We may still not decide to show it, but if we do show it, we're not going to tamper with it.
I suppose just to add to that, from our office's point of view, if you're in a position to assist non-government groups or local businesses put together business cases, we'd love to think that you were familiar with our tools, say the regional profiles, to be able to just kind of advise people who might be coming into the library looking for that sort of data.
And just, I guess, to go back to the kind of points I was sort of finishing on about the platform, and to reiterate what's been said already, the libraries are at that community interface in a very physical way, and the providers of the platforms that perhaps request our information and writing to go into them, whether they're kind of Facebook or whatever, are certainly not at all responsive to the needs of local communities, right? Even though they talk about creating communities, they're a kind of commercial entity that's attempting to, aggregate users in order to sell advertising to them. And I think that is, and it's wonderful, but I think it's important to see that, the libraries always had a different kind of function, which is that it does actually bring a physical community of people who live in a place together. And some of, a lot of the initiatives which have already been discussed are, seem to be about bringing those people into that space with that in mind, where it's about, about communities starting to set their own agenda around what kinds of cultural production they want or might want, rather than what just seems to be what's being kind of requested from afar.
So should we have a meeting room and a recording studio?
I think that's actually happening in other countries around the world. Like if you look at what's happening in UK, through London and Birmingham, they're already doing that. They've got some very, they're reaching out in the area of business enterprise. And the big gap they're actually filling is those who, we've got incubators and startup centres in Queensland and flexible work centres, but what we don't have, and the gap that libraries fill that void, is a person who doesn't have any business experience and's got an idea but doesn't have that place to go to where they get that advice. And libraries do provide that. And what's increasingly happening, particularly in UK, is that the librarian skill sets are going into becoming business advisors almost.
That's great. Guys, would you like to thank Jenny, John and Danny for us? Fantastic. There's some fantastic conversations that I think we're going to be able to have during our breaks, as well as grabbing a coffee and something to eat. We're going to have some morning tea now outside on the terrace, and we're just running a little bit behind on our program at the moment. So at 10 to 12, we'll begin our morning workshops, and then the workshop facilitators have been notified that we're running a little bit late as well, and so we're going to push lunch out just till 1:15, just another 15 minutes. So 10 to 12 will be when the workshops begin. Between now and then, though, out on the terrace for some coffee, morning tea, and some further conversation. Thank you very much.